close your eyes for a moment and imagine history not as a collection of battles, speeches, or revolutions, but as a slow river. Most of the time, it moves gently, quietly, without rapids or storms. Only once in a while does it crash against rocks or burst its banks in floods. And yet, it is during those slower stretches of the river, the calm ones, that most people actually lived their lives. When we talk about history, especially American history, our minds quickly jump to the moments of noise and drama: the Revolution, the Civil War, the Great Depression, the fight for civil rights, the terror of September 11. These are the stories that fill textbooks, documentaries, and movies. They are the points on the timeline that seem to glow more brightly than the rest. But in between those bright sparks are long stretches of quieter years, the years often labeled, sometimes unkindly, as boring. These forgotten years are not filled with battles or speeches that echo in memory. Instead, they hold the soft rhythm of everyday life: people tending to their farms, children walking to one-room schools, shopkeepers opening shutters in the morning, families gathering for supper under candlelight, or the hum of early electric bulbs. The truth is that history is mostly made of these stretches of ordinary time. For every famous moment that we remember, there are countless days when nothing big happened. The 1820s in America, for example, are often remembered as the era of good feelings. It was a time when the nation seemed to pause after the War of 1812, a time before Andrew Jackson shook politics, before the Civil War tore the country apart. For many, it was a decade without major drama. In school, it often gets reduced to a sentence: the era of good feelings, when America was calm. Students turn the page quickly, waiting for the fireworks of battles or elections. But what does it mean for a time to be boring? For the people who lived then, life was not boring at all. It was real, filled with chores, hopes, quiet joys, and private struggles. A farmer in New York still had to worry about the weather ruining his crops. A family in Ohio still found pride in building a new home out of timber. A mother in Virginia still told bedtime stories to her children, hoping for a better future. The label, boring, is something that comes later when historians look back. To us, the decades without wars or disasters can seem dull in comparison. Yet, if you pause and breathe and listen to the silence of these years, you can hear something different. You can hear the sound of a country quietly growing. It is in these forgotten stretches that America expanded westward. Mile by mile, family by family, wagon by wagon, railroads were being imagined. Small towns turned into cities. Letters carried thoughts across great distances. These years were the heartbeat of ordinary lives, and though they lacked the excitement of battlefields, they carried the weight of human experience. Consider, too, the 1990s, a time not so far behind us. For those who lived it, the decade felt comfortable, even predictable. The Cold War had ended, the United States was prosperous, and many Americans were caught up in the rise of the internet, pop culture, and a booming economy. To some, it felt like a pause in history, a decade without a great crisis. But in that quietness, the foundations of the world we live in today were being laid. Foundations of technology, culture, and politics that only became obvious after 9/11 shook the sense of peace. This is the paradox of boring history. On the surface, it seems uneventful. But beneath that surface, seeds are always being planted. The calm years give shape to what comes after. They are the silent preparation before storms, the hidden growth before dramatic change. So, in this series of chapters, we will not rush toward the explosions of history. Instead, we will slow down. We will linger in the quiet decades that are often skipped over in textbooks. We will walk through the 1820s, the 1850s before war, the 1870s after conflict, the 1990s before crisis. And as we move gently through these periods, we will notice how much life was lived in the stillness and how much the so-called boring years mattered. Imagine lying back, the lights dim, your breathing steady, as we wander through these forgotten corridors of American history. We will not find loud declarations here, but we will find whispers, the sound of pen on paper, as someone writes a diary, the shuffle of boots on dirt roads, the murmur of conversations in kitchens and fields. These are the sounds of the boring years. In truth, no year is ever truly boring. Each year carries its own weight of births and deaths, struggles and victories, small as they may be. A child born in 1822 grew up to witness the Civil War. A teenager in 1995 became an adult in a post-9/11 world. Quiet years still shape lives, and lives shape history. Perhaps calling them boring is unfair. Perhaps a better word would be overlooked. Overlooked by historians, by storytellers, by us. And yet, in these overlooked years, America became itself. As we begin this journey, let the quietness of these forgotten times settle around you. Breathe slowly, as if you are stepping into a calm room, where the noise of battles and politics has faded away. We are not here to be startled awake by cannon fire or impassioned speeches. We are here to drift gently into the still waters of history, and to see that even in calmness there is meaning. The forgotten years are waiting for us, and in their silence, they have much to say. The decade of the 1820s in the United States is often remembered with a single phrase, the era of good feelings. At first glance, it sounds comforting, an age of peace, unity, and optimism. And in many ways, that is true. But the name itself also reveals why the period is so often brushed aside in history books. Compared to the fiery debates of the Revolutionary War or the deep divisions that would lead to the Civil War, the 1820s seem quiet, uneventful, almost boring. And yet, for the millions of men, women, and children who lived through those years, life was anything but boring. It was the steady hum of daily work, the building of communities, and the cautious hope of a young nation still finding its way. Imagine walking through an American town in the 1820s. The streets are dusty, lined with wooden houses and small shops. At dawn, the baker is already awake, kneading dough and setting loaves into brick ovens. Farmers ride in from the countryside with wagons full of corn, wheat, and apples. Children run barefoot through yards, their laughter mixing with the sound of roosters crowing. A blacksmith strikes his hammer against iron, sparks flying in rhythm with the heartbeat of the town. Nothing dramatic happens here, but life is full. Politically, the country seemed calm. James Monroe, the president at the start of the decade, was widely liked. For a brief moment, America felt united. The bitter divisions between Federalists and Democratic Republicans had faded, leaving the impression of harmony. Newspapers praised the spirit of agreement, calling it an age of good feelings, and for ordinary Americans that sense of peace meant stability, a chance to focus on farms, shops, schools, and homes rather than war or rebellion. But underneath the surface, quiet shifts were taking place. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn a fragile line between free states and slave states, a line that would not hold forever. Westward expansion was accelerating, families moving by wagon into Ohio, Indiana, and beyond. Forests were cleared for fields, rivers crossed by ferries, towns sprouting where only wilderness had stood before. It was a time of motion, though not of noise. For those who lived in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, or New York, the 1820s brought small changes that hinted at the future. Street lamps began to appear in certain neighborhoods. The first horse-drawn streetcars rattled down cobblestone roads. Steamboats churned along rivers, shrinking distances between towns. Newspapers spread ideas faster than ever before. The pace of daily life was still slow by modern standards, but compared to a generation earlier, the world felt just a little smaller. In the evenings, life returned to its rhythms of quiet. Families gathered by firelight or candlelight. Mothers spun thread or mended clothes. Fathers read newspapers aloud. Children listened to stories or practiced their lessons on slates. The air smelled of wood smoke and cooked stews, the soft creak of wooden chairs filling the silence. For most people, the concerns of each day were simple: food, weather, family, and faith. To us, looking back, it can seem like nothing important was happening. But pause for a moment. This was the decade when writers like Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper began to shape an American voice in literature. This was when the first stirrings of reform movements, education, temperance, women's rights, began to whisper in towns and churches. This was when young men and women grew up, who would later stand on the front lines of abolition, politics, and invention. Even in calm years, the roots of change are quietly spreading underground. Think of a young boy in the 1820s, growing up on a farm in Kentucky. His days are filled with chores, feeding animals, carrying water, helping his father plow the fields. He knows nothing of political debates in Washington, nothing of compromises and treaties. But he is learning discipline, endurance, and patience. By the time he reaches adulthood, the world around him will have changed, and he will step into it shaped by the quiet lessons of his youth. Or think of a young girl in Massachusetts, helping her mother by candlelight. She learns to read from a worn Bible, practices her letters on a chalkboard, and listens to stories told by her grandparents. She cannot yet imagine the factories that will rise in New England or the movements that will one day give her a voice. But she is growing in a world that is slowly, silently preparing for those changes. The 1820s were also a time of hope mixed with unease. The United States was still young, only a few decades removed from its revolution. Many people wondered, would this experiment in democracy survive? Could a country so large, so varied, hold together? For now, the answer seemed to be yes. But the calmness was fragile, like the surface of a lake before a storm. And so, the decade drifts past us like a gentle breeze. Days turn into months, months into years, without the sharp cracks of war or the drama of great speeches. Instead, there is the steady rhythm of ordinary life. Farmers plant, harvest, and plant again. Children grow taller. Cities stretch their streets a little farther outward. The river of history flows quietly, but it does not stop. When we look back, it is tempting to skip over these years, to label them dull, to hurry on to the louder chapters. But the quiet calm of the 1820s mattered deeply. It gave the nation a chance to breathe, to expand, to dream. It gave ordinary people the space to live and grow, to shape families and communities that would carry forward into more turbulent times. So tonight, as you drift into rest, let your mind wander through these forgotten streets. Hear the sound of wagon wheels on dirt roads, the laughter of children at play, the steady ringing of the blacksmith's hammer. Smell the bread baking in village ovens, the smoke curling from chimneys into the evening sky. These were the moments of the 1820s. Quiet, simple, steady. Not boring at all, but full of life. And as the stars rose above those towns 2 centuries ago, people went to sleep with the same hopes we carry today: peace, comfort, and the promise of tomorrow. When we think about politics in history, we often imagine it as a loud, dramatic affair. Debates in Congress, fiery speeches, elections that divide families, and protests that fill the streets. And yes, those moments do happen. But in the so-called boring years of American history, politics moved more like a slow clock than a roaring fire. Decisions were made, compromises reached, and debates recorded in newspapers. But to most people, the pace felt steady, deliberate, even distant. In the 1820s, politics in Washington seemed calm on the surface. James Monroe was president at the beginning of the decade, and he carried an air of quiet dignity. He was not a man of drama. He did not seek to stir crowds with fiery rhetoric. Instead, he embodied a kind of stillness. Newspapers praised this era as one of unity, of fewer divisions between political parties. The great battles of the revolutionary generation were behind, and the storms of civil conflict were still ahead. But for ordinary Americans, national politics often felt far away. A farmer in Ohio, for example, might know who the president was, but he cared more about whether the soil would yield enough corn this year. A shopkeeper in Philadelphia might glance at headlines about treaties or tariffs, but his real concern was how many customers would walk through his door. For millions of people, politics was a distant hum, while the rhythm of daily life beat loudly in their ears. Daily life in the 1820s was simple in its routines, though not easy by our modern standards. At dawn, families woke to tend animals, stoke fires, and prepare breakfast. Children had chores before school, gathering eggs, hauling water, sweeping floors. Work filled the daylight hours, whether in fields, workshops, or small stores. Evenings were quiet, lit by candles or oil lamps, filled with the soft sounds of conversation, Bible readings, or stories told by elders. Education was slowly spreading in these years. One-room schoolhouses dotted towns and villages, with a single teacher guiding children of all ages. Lessons were basic reading, writing, arithmetic, often memorized by repetition. Chalk squeaked on small slates, and children practiced their letters under the patient, watchful eyes of their instructors. For many families, education was a prized gift, even if limited. A child who could read and write carried the promise of a brighter future. Religion, too, shaped the calm decades. Sunday was a sacred day of rest. Churches were not just places of worship, but centers of community life. Sermons guided moral thought, while church gatherings connected families and neighbors. It was in churches that whispers of reform first began, whispers that would later grow into movements for temperance, abolition, and education. But in the 1820s, these voices were still quiet like seeds under the soil. For women, life was full of labor that history books rarely record. They baked bread, spun thread, sewed clothing, tended gardens, and cared for children. They were keepers of home life, ensuring that meals were served and households ran smoothly. For enslaved women in the South, these tasks were even heavier, marked by hardship and grief, yet carried out with strength that often went unnoticed in official records. Their stories remind us that even in quiet decades, lives could hold both endurance and silent suffering. Technology was slowly creeping into the everyday. The arrival of the steamboat changed how people traveled and traded. What once took weeks by land could now take days by water. In towns and cities, newspapers multiplied, carrying news not just from Washington, but from Europe, Asia, and beyond. Though politics still seemed slow, the world felt as though it was gradually drawing closer. And yet, despite these small shifts, most days for most people were defined by routine. Farmers rose with the sun, worked the soil, and slept when darkness fell. Shopkeepers opened their doors in the morning and swept their floors at night. Mothers soothed children with lullabies that echoed the same melodies their own mothers had sung. It was life lived in small steps, not in great leaps. From our modern perspective, these years can feel uneventful. Textbooks hurry past them. Students skim through a few paragraphs and move on. But if you pause and linger, you begin to see their quiet importance. The everyday lives of ordinary people were the foundation upon which dramatic events would later rise. Without the steady work of these calm years, of planting fields, building schools, shaping communities, the nation could not have endured its future storms. Think of it this way: great speeches and battles may light up history like lightning flashes, but everyday life is the ground those flashes illuminate. Without the ground, there would be no storm to see. The boring, Years were that ground, steady and reliable, holding the weight of all that was to come. Let us imagine one ordinary evening in the 1820s. A family gathers in a small wooden home on the edge of a town. The father sets aside his tools after a long day of carpentry. The mother tends a pot of stew over the hearth. Children sit at a table, practicing their writing by candlelight. Outside, crickets sing in the grass, and the sound of a wagon passes faintly down the road. The family eats together, prays together, and settles into the night. Nothing unusual happens, nothing history books would record. But in that moment, the story of a nation is quietly unfolding. This was the essence of the boring years, not silence but steadiness. A country building itself through countless ordinary days. A people living lives filled with quiet dignity, their actions small but vital. Politics moved slowly, yes, but everyday life marched forward with determination. As you rest now, think of those lives. Imagine their voices fading into the quiet of the night, their hopes as simple as ours: warmth, safety, family, and peace. The boring years were never truly boring. They were the soft pulse of history, beating steadily while the world prepared for its louder chapters. If you pause for a moment and imagine America in the 1850s, your mind might rush to thoughts of looming conflict, fairy speeches about slavery, and the tensions that would ultimately spill into the Civil War. And yet, when we look closer at the decade itself, we find that much of the 1850s were filled not with dramatic explosions of violence, but with a kind of restless quiet, the feeling of waiting, of holding one's breath before the storm. It is this quiet, this in-between state, that gives the 1850s their place among the so-called boring years of American history. They are remembered less for dramatic change than for the long stretches of uneventful life in towns, farms, and growing cities. Across the countryside, families rose with the dawn, their mornings shaped by familiar patterns. Farmers tended to their crops, their hands moving across the earth in a rhythm that had not changed in generations. Mothers prepared meals from simple ingredients: cornbread, beans, and stews simmering slowly. Children fetched water, gathered eggs, or studied in small schoolhouses where lessons were brief and practical. To them, history was not unfolding in some dramatic clash of armies, but in the steady passage of seasons. In small towns, life took on a predictable pace. Markets opened on Saturdays, where neighbors exchanged goods and news. Blacksmiths hammered away at iron, their shops ringing with the sound of labor. Storefronts sold fabrics, tools, and small luxuries shipped from the east. Evenings were quiet, candles lit, families gathering by the fireplace, stories told, and Bibles read aloud. The wider political world may have been growing tense, but for most people, those tensions arrived only as rumors in newspapers or whispers carried by travelers. Many did not yet sense how close the nation was to fracture. The day-to-day rhythm seemed too steady, too ordinary, to suggest such a future. Cities, of course, told a slightly different story. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were expanding rapidly, their docks crowded with ships and their streets filled with carts, wagons, and pedestrians. Immigration was reshaping the character of these urban centers. German and Irish families arrived in great numbers, seeking opportunity, and yet for all the new movement, most days passed without remarkable incident. Streets bustled, factories hummed, and homes were built. It was a hum of activity, but not the kind that makes headlines. Even in politics, the decade seemed, at times, to move in circles rather than in leaps. The Compromise of 1850 had sought to calm disputes over slavery, and for a short time it seemed to do just that. Debates continued, but they often stalled, repeating familiar arguments in the halls of Congress. For the ordinary citizen, the great questions of the nation remained distant, complex, confusing, and perhaps best left to those in Washington. Railroads stretched further westward, stitching the vast landscape together. But to those who rode them, it was less a moment of revolution and more a simple, practical matter: faster travel, easier shipments, cheaper goods. Few recognized how transformative these steel lines would one day be. In the moment, it was simply progress, quiet, steady, not dramatic. And then there was the matter of culture, of the ordinary ways people passed their time. In towns and cities, music drifted from parlors where pianos sat proudly as symbols of refinement. Popular novels were passed from hand to hand, stories of adventure and romance that entertained without stirring political passions. Church gatherings filled Sundays, where sermons emphasized morality and order. The tone was one of stability, of keeping life steady in uncertain times. For African Americans, both enslaved and free, the decade carried a heavier weight. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 created fear and unease, especially in the North, where free black communities lived under the shadow of possible capture. And yet even here, daily life often looked uneventful from the outside. Work performed quietly, families gathered in the evenings, children taught in secret schools. Beneath that surface calm, however, ran an undercurrent of fear and quiet resistance. The truth of the 1850s is that they were not entirely calm. The decade held incidents: the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the violence known as Bleeding Kansas, the famous debates between Lincoln and Douglas. But these moments, while significant, unfolded slowly, and often far away from the daily life of the majority. For the average citizen, they were pieces of news to be read, considered, and then set aside as life continued its steady course. This is what makes the 1850s such a striking example of boring history. They were years defined less by decisive events than by the waiting, the ordinary living, the sense that things were both stable and fragile at the same time. It was the stillness before the storm, and in that stillness, life carried on as it always had. We might imagine the sound of a quiet street at dusk in 1855, the clop of a horse returning to its stable, the soft glow of oil lamps in windows, the low hum of conversation from a family porch. These moments, not recorded in grand histories, are what filled the decade for most Americans. Looking back, we know what was coming. We know the storm would break in 1861, reshaping the nation forever. But those who lived through the 1850s did not see the future so clearly. To them, these were simply the days of their lives, predictable, steady, sometimes uneventful, sometimes quietly anxious. And so the 1850s remain in memory, a kind of overlooked space, not the drama of revolution, nor yet the tragedy of war, but the calm in between, forgotten by many, dismissed as boring, yet filled with the daily lives of millions. In this way, the boring years remind us of something important: that history is not only the story of battles and speeches. It is also the story of ordinary evenings, uneventful weeks, and quiet decades, where the true fabric of a nation is woven. The 1870s in America are often remembered only in fragments, a decade tucked quietly between the bloody memory of the Civil War and the drama of the Gilded Age's full bloom, a time when, on the surface, the nation seemed to move at a slow, almost uneventful pace. Yet, beneath that stillness, small changes crept forward, changes that would one day shape the nation's future. When the war ended in 1865, America had been scarred. The years immediately after were consumed with Reconstruction, political battles, and the question of how to stitch the Union back together. But by the 1870s, much of that loudness had begun to fade. The political struggle still existed, yet for most people, daily life looked steady, almost uneventful. Farms were tended, families moved into growing towns. The railroads stretched further and further across the map, like veins quietly carrying energy into a body. But the way history remembers this time is different. The 1870s are rarely highlighted in textbooks with the same intensity as the Civil War or the Industrial Revolution. Instead, they seem to float like a forgotten pause, a decade of shadows, neither crisis nor celebration. If you were to walk through an American town in those years, what you would find would not be fireworks of progress, but rather the gentle hum of ordinary life. Blacksmiths worked steadily in their shops. Children played on dirt roads lined with wooden fences. Women hung laundry on the lines, the breeze carrying a rhythm of quiet routine. Railroads, though, were perhaps the loudest presence. By the mid-1870s, iron tracks stretched across plains and mountains, pulling goods, people, and ideas from coast to coast. It was not glamorous in the moment. It was work, heavy labor, and constant movement. But slowly, these trains were stitching America's vast spaces together. For the first time, small towns could feel connected to distant cities, and farmers could imagine selling crops far beyond the horizon they could see. The word gilded would later be used to describe this era, made famous by Mark Twain. He called it gilded, not golden, because what seemed bright and shining on the outside often hid something fragile or corrupt underneath. But during the 1870s, the shine had not yet hardened into legend. People were simply living, trying to find balance in the quiet years after war and before the rapid storms of industrial power. In politics, the decade did not see grand moments that captured the public imagination. The presidency passed quietly from Ulysses S. Grant into Rutherford B. Hayes, both figures remembered more for steady hands than dramatic change. Scandals existed, whispers of corruption in government and railroads, yet for the average American farmer or shopkeeper, these were distant murmurs. What mattered was whether the crops grew, whether prices held steady, and whether families could carve out their piece of stability. Cities, though, were beginning to swell. The 1870s marked the early shadows of urbanization. Immigration, though not at its peak yet, was beginning to bring new voices and faces into neighborhoods. Factories, still modest in size compared to what they would become, were humming quietly with machines and workers. But even here, there was no great headline to catch attention. Instead, there was routine, the soft, daily rhythm of labor. Even the culture of the time feels muted. Newspapers carried stories, but not the roaring debates of revolution or war. Instead, small-town papers wrote about fairs, harvests, and the occasional scandal in local politics. Families found comfort in community gatherings, church picnics, and county events. Life was not spectacular, but it was steady. The economy, however, carried shadows of its own. In 1873, the panic hit, a financial collapse that shook banks and businesses, but it was not remembered in the same thunderous way as the crashes of the 20th century. For many, it meant hard times, yet the story of those struggles faded quietly into the background of history. The nation endured, adapted, and moved forward, often without realizing how these small moments shaped resilience. What makes the 1870s so easily forgotten is that it was a time of in-betweens. Not a war, not yet a full industrial empire. Not the wild frontier of earlier decades, but not yet the massive cities of later years. It was a transition, a quiet middle chapter, where people lived lives that did not feel remarkable at the time. And yet, within those shadows, foundations were forming. The railroad's steady march, the slow spread of factories, the growing hum of cities, all were laying groundwork for the explosions of change to come. The boring years were not truly boring, they were hidden years, the quiet stitching together of a nation into something larger. If you listen closely to the 1870s, you hear the echo of hammers on steel rails. You hear the whisper of farmers planting another season's crop. You hear children laughing in dusty streets, unaware that they live in a decade history would one day glance over. The 1870s were not glamorous. They were not filled with headline victories or catastrophic defeats. But they were, in their calm, an important pause. A moment where America took a breath, healed its wounds, and slowly turned its gaze toward a future it could not yet imagine. As you close your eyes tonight and drift deeper into rest, picture the quiet shadows of that decade. Imagine the trains slowly crossing the plains, the towns growing in small steps, the people living in rhythms of work and family. Nothing explosive, nothing loud, just the soft, steady heartbeat of a nation in its gilded shadows. And in that calm, perhaps you can feel the comfort of knowing that even in boring times, history is always alive, quietly shaping what comes next. The 1920s often bring to mind lively jazz clubs, sparkling dresses, and fast-moving cars. When people hear the word Roaring Twenties, they imagine a decade filled with sound, motion, and glitter. Yet beneath the glittering surface, much of the decade was marked by quiet normalcy. For every bright jazz note, there were countless moments of routine life, calm evenings in small towns, steady days in growing suburbs, and years that passed without dramatic headlines. In many ways, the 1920s were not just roaring, they were also still ordinary, and almost boring, in the best sense of the word. After the shock of World War I, Americans entered the decade searching for calm. They had lived through years of loss and uncertainty, and now they wanted peace. Politically, the country retreated into stability. The presidents of the 1920s, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, were not fiery figures. They did not inspire the kind of passion or controversy that other leaders might. Their focus was often on keeping things steady, predictable, and quiet. To many, this made national politics feel uneventful. Decisions were made, speeches were given, but the everyday lives of citizens went on with little disturbance. In towns across the nation, life carried a rhythm of stillness. Families gathered around radios in the evening, listening not to dramatic news but to music, baseball games, or sermons broadcast through the airwaves. Radios themselves were a marvel of technology, but once the novelty settled, they became part of routine. Much like a modern television quietly humming in the background, the radio provided gentle companionship to evenings otherwise filled with calm conversation or the turning of pages in a book. The decade also saw the growth of suburbs. New houses lined neat streets and families embraced the rhythm of predictable days. Men often left for work in the morning while women tended to homes, and children walked to nearby schools. Yards were trimmed, sidewalks swept, and neighborhoods carried the scent of cooking dinners in the evening. In such places, the 1920s were far from roaring. They were quiet, steady, and comforting. The ordinariness of this time is what many lived and remembered, simple days that were not written into history books. In cities, of course, the nightlife grew. Jazz clubs and theaters attracted excitement, but even in cities, much of life remained calm. Office workers filed into buildings each morning, sat at their desks, typed, calculated, and returned home by evening. The excitement of the decade existed, but it was a thin layer resting on top of deeper routines. For every sparkling dress in a club, there were hundreds of plain work shirts worn by clerks, factory workers, and shopkeepers who lived steady lives. Calm also extended to global affairs. Unlike the wars and conflicts that would mark later decades, the 1920s seemed like a pause in international drama. The United States avoided major conflicts, preferring to look inward. For the average citizen, headlines were not filled with invasions or crises, but with stories about baseball inventions and local happenings. It was a time when the absence of crisis itself shaped memory, a time when things seemed so ordinary that they later felt forgettable. Of course, changes were happening quietly. Cars multiplied on the roads, reshaping towns and cities. Airplanes, once a novelty, began to promise new futures. Silent films brought crowds together in theaters, creating shared moments of wonder. Yet even these innovations blended into the calm rhythm of life. They did not bring the shock of war or the chaos of depression. They were instead gentle waves of progress, absorbed into daily life almost without notice. For many Americans, the decade was defined less by jazz clubs and more by evenings on porches. Sitting outside in the summer warmth, neighbors spoke softly while crickets filled the night. Families enjoyed picnics, Sunday drives, and church gatherings. In this sense, the 1920s were not just about energy. They were about ordinary contentment. The stillness of these years gave people a sense of stability they longed for after the turbulence of the 1910s. The stock market did rise during this period, but for the average person, it was distant and unseen. Farmers worked their fields, shopkeepers tended to stores, and children played in yards. They did not live with the thought of financial crashes or economic collapse. To them, life was simply steady. This everyday stillness is what makes the decade feel boring, in hindsight, yet it is this very quiet that many found comforting. As the decade moved forward, the rhythm did not seem to change. From the perspective of someone living in 1926 or 1927, the world seemed calm, perhaps permanently so. People planned for the future without fear of sudden disaster. Newspapers carried stories of new dances, new cars, and sports victories. Rarely did they carry the heaviness of looming crises. Yet, just beneath this stillness, small cracks were forming. Farmers struggled with falling crop prices. Factories produced goods faster than they could be sold. But for most people, these warnings were invisible. The ordinary calm of life continued, undisturbed, until the crash of 1929 broke the illusion of stillness. Looking back, the 1920s remind us of how easy it is to overlook the quiet years. When nothing dramatic happens, history calls them boring. Yet those years of stillness carried their own meaning. They provided a pause between storms, a rhythm of calm that allowed people to breathe, to dream, and to believe in steady days. The boring years of the 1920s mattered because they were lived fully, even if they were later overshadowed by louder events. For those who lived through them, the stillness was real. The 1920s were not always roaring. They were also peaceful, steady, and quietly. The 1950s in the United States are often remembered for their simplicity, their predictability, and their routine. They are pictured as years filled with quiet suburban neighborhoods, carefully trimmed lawns, pastel-colored homes, and families gathered around a television set in the evening. Compared to the turbulent decades that came before, and the upheavals that followed, the 50s sometimes feel like a pause in the rhythm of American history. It was a decade of repetition, of small details, of quiet comforts. For many people, life followed a gentle routine. The morning began with the sound of an alarm clock, the smell of brewed coffee, and the rustling of a newspaper spread across a kitchen table. Fathers often left for work in identical gray suits, carrying briefcases that seemed to contain the same papers every day. Mothers stayed home, tending to household chores, folding laundry, and preparing meals, while children hurried off to school with lunch boxes in hand. Suburbia itself was designed to create an atmosphere of order. Rows of nearly identical houses stretched along winding streets. Lawns were cut short, driveways were swept clean, and mailboxes stood in perfect lines. Neighbors greeted one another politely, often knowing each other's names, but rarely prying too deeply. Evenings brought the familiar sight of families gathering in living rooms, where television programs became the quiet heartbeat of daily life. Sitcoms, game shows, and variety hours filled the air with light laughter, a constant background hum in American households. There were, of course, larger forces at work. The Cold War lingered in the background, but most of the time, its tension did not touch the lives of everyday families. Instead, it was something spoken of on the radio, seen in newspaper headlines, or whispered about in classrooms during drills. On the surface, the 50s seemed calm, even uneventful. But beneath that calm was a layer of quiet watchfulness, awaiting for something that had not yet arrived. For young people, the decade was defined by predictability. Schools followed strict routines, with bells marking every hour and lessons repeating the same phrases. After school, children played in safe streets, riding bicycles or tossing balls, while teenagers gathered at soda fountains or listened to music on jukeboxes. Rock and roll was beginning to emerge, but in its early days it was still just a faint background noise, not yet the cultural revolution it would soon become. Sundays carried a particular rhythm. Families dressed neatly and went to church, filling pews with quiet reverence. Afterwards, meals were shared at home, often with extended family, the same recipes passed down year after year. The repetition itself gave life a steady rhythm, one that many would later remember as safe, if not thrilling. The 50s were also a decade of waiting for the children to grow up, waiting for the next holiday, waiting for news from the outside world that might disturb the calm, waiting for something that was not yet visible, but somehow already felt. For historians, the 1950s can seem boring because so little appears to happen in between the dramatic events that define other decades. Yet for those who lived through it, there was a gentle beauty in the ordinary. There was a comfort in the familiar sound of a lawnmower on a Saturday morning, in the glow of a black and white television set in the evening, in the warmth of neighbors sharing coffee on a porch. Perhaps the 1950s remind us that history is not only made of wars, protests, and crises. It is also made of small, ordinary moments, the slow afternoons, the predictable routines, the sense of safety that allows life to move quietly forward. In these boring years, generations were raised, communities were built, and memories were formed, even if they did not make the headlines. And so, as we drift through the 1950s, we step into a world of stillness and predictability, a world where calm repetition was not seen as dull, but as reassuring, a world where history seemed to pause, even as time quietly carried everyone forward. The 1970s are often remembered for the oil crisis, the end of the Vietnam War, and the resignation of President Nixon. Yet if we step back and listen to the quieter tones of history, the mid to late 1970s also reveal a stretch of time that felt muted. A lull between storms, a pause in the noise of history. After the chaos of the 1960s, the protests, the assassinations, the civil rights battles, and the war that seemed endless, the United States entered the mid-1970s with a sense of tiredness. The nation exhaled as if too weary to carry on with drama for a while. Ordinary life became the rhythm of the day, and for many, that meant settling into patterns that seemed uneventful, even boring. Imagine the suburbs during this time. Rows of houses built in the 1950s and 60s were now filled with families raising children who had never known the Great Depression or World War II. These children grew up with Saturday morning cartoons, school lunches, and the sound of rotary phones ringing in the kitchen. For them, the world felt stable, safe, and unremarkable. The streets were quieter. Neighbors still knew each other by name, often stopping for small conversations over fences. The big events of politics were far away, discussed in brief mentions on the evening news, but not always felt in the day-to-day life of ordinary households. The rhythm of life was slower, anchored by routines. Television became the evening companion for millions. Families gathered around small screens to watch sitcoms and variety shows. Programs like Happy Days or The Mary Tyler Moore Show offered a sense of lightness, even comfort. These shows did not dwell on the heavy questions of society. Instead, they reflected a desire for calm, a return to something ordinary after years of unrest. At the same time, music was shifting. Disco rose quietly out of dance halls and nightclubs, giving people a chance to escape into rhythm and movement. For some, it was exciting and new, but for others, it was just background noise to an otherwise uneventful decade. The concerts, the records, and the dances, these became the small sparks of excitement in an otherwise steady period. Economically, life in the mid-70s was marked by inflation, but even that felt less like drama and more like a slow, steady weight pressing on households. Prices in grocery stores rose a little higher each week. Gasoline shortages created long lines at stations, yet even those lines became part of the routine. A frustration repeated often enough to feel ordinary. For students in schools, history textbooks often ended with the Second World War, leaving recent decades still unwritten. To them, the 1970s felt like filler, a time between great movements. They memorized facts for tests but rarely felt they were living in an era of significance. Life was about homework, part-time jobs, and the quiet wait for something new to happen. Universities, once hotbeds of protest, grew quieter too. The campus unrest of the 1960s had left its mark, but now many students focused on careers, stability, and personal growth rather than political upheaval. Libraries and lecture halls were filled with a calm determination, but not with rebellion. And yet, beneath this stillness, change was quietly gathering. Technology was advancing in small, unnoticed steps. Computers, once the size of rooms, were beginning to shrink. Silicon Valley was slowly taking shape, though few outside of specialized circles knew what it meant. In everyday life, these shifts went unseen. People carried on, not knowing that the calm of the 1970s would soon give way to the stormy transformations of the 1980s. Internationally, the Cold War continued, but it often played out like a quiet hum in the background. There were talks, treaties, and moments of tension, but none of it broke into the daily lives of most Americans. For them, the Cold War was a distant concept, something read about in newspapers, not lived on their doorsteps. The late 1970s gave Americans a chance to breathe between upheavals. They lived their days in a slower rhythm: school, work, television, weekends at the mall, and quiet evenings on porches. It was not dramatic, and perhaps that is why this period feels so boring to later generations. But within its calm, there was a kind of healing. A recovery from storms past. When we think of history, we often look for moments of noise, of battles and breakthroughs. But the 1970s lull reminds us that history is also made of silence, of evenings spent watching television, of quiet dinners, of days that felt the same, but together formed a decade. This, too, is history, the stillness between the storms. When we think of the 1990s in the United States, we often picture a decade defined by bright colors, new technology, and a sense of optimism. The Cold War had ended, and for the first time in nearly half a century, the world no longer seemed overshadowed by the constant fear of nuclear conflict. It was a time when many Americans felt safe, stable, and even a little complacent. Yet, because of this sense of security, the 1990s are often described as boring, in comparison to the crises and dramatic events that came before and after. In the early part of the decade, the Gulf War came and went quickly, leaving many people with the impression that America's military power was unmatched. But beyond that brief conflict, the world seemed calm. The economy grew steadily, fueled by the rise of computers and the internet. Suburban neighborhoods expanded, shopping malls thrived, and television shows like Friends and Seinfeld painted a picture of an everyday life filled with humor and simplicity. For many families, the 1990s were about routine. Parents drove minivans, children played video games, and schools buzzed with the arrival of the internet in classrooms. The excitement of innovation was present, but it was slow, gradual, and often unnoticed at the time. A dial-up connection was not dramatic, it was just another small step forward. Cell phones were bulky, rarely used outside of emergencies, and few people imagined they would one day become central to daily life. Politics during this period felt distant to many ordinary people. Bill Clinton's presidency dominated the headlines, but his administration was marked more by debates over the budget, scandals, and partisan struggles than by major wars or economic collapse. For many citizens, political events felt like background noise rather than world-shaking transformations. Government seemed steady, predictable, and sometimes uninspiring. This sense of normalcy extended into international relations as well. With the Soviet Union gone, America stood alone as the world's dominant power. Conflicts existed, of course, but they were far away and did not disturb the daily lives of most Americans. News stories covered events in Somalia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, yet these felt distant compared to the lived experience of quiet suburban nights, Friday trips to Blockbuster, and Saturday mornings with cartoons on television. The culture of the 1990s reflected this sense of stability. Music was diverse, ranging from grunge to pop to hip-hop, but the overall mood of the decade carried less tension than the protest songs of the 1960s or the disco escapism of the 1970s. Movies focused on adventure, romance, and lighthearted comedy. Even the biggest anxieties of the time, like the Y2K computer bug, ended up fading away into nothing more than a momentary worry. For younger generations, this was a time of exploration without fear. College campuses expanded internet use, students sent their first emails, and many discovered the early stages of online communities. Yet these quiet beginnings felt small compared to what would come later. It was a decade of seeds being planted, seeds of technological change, cultural transformation, and geopolitical shifts that would not fully grow until after the decade had ended. Looking back, it is easy to see why the 1990s are remembered as calm, even boring. They were years without great upheaval, without daily fear of nuclear war, and without the national trauma that came after September 11, 2001. But this very calmness was itself unusual. In the sweep of U.S. history, decades of relative peace and prosperity are rare. What felt like an ordinary and uneventful time was, in fact, a kind of historical luxury, a pause before the storms of the 21st century. The quietness of the 1990s is not a sign that nothing mattered. Instead, it is a reminder that history is not only made in moments of crisis and revolution, it is also made in the long stretches of daily life, where small changes accumulate unnoticed. The 1990s gave birth to the internet age, to a new global economy, and to cultural shifts that continue to shape the present. But at the time, it felt simple, steady, and, in the words of many who lived through it, comfortably boring. And as with the earlier quiet decades, the 1820s, the 1870s, the 1950s, the 1990s remind us that sometimes, the most overlooked years are the ones that set the stage for everything that follows. When we look back at history, our eyes are often drawn to the sparks, the revolutions, the wars, the sudden crashes, and the soaring recoveries. These moments feel bright, fiery, and loud, demanding to be remembered. They make their way into textbooks, movies, and national myths. But for every battle or crisis, there are stretches of time that feel quieter, less eventful. These are the years often described as boring. Years when nothing seemed to happen, when daily life moved steadily forward, and when history felt, at least on the surface, still. Yet, it is in these calm years that much of human life is truly lived. The uneventful stretches, the 1820s, the suburban 1950s, the pre-9/11 1990s, hold lessons of their own. They remind us that history is not only the story of battles fought and leaders chosen, but also of quiet habits, unnoticed changes, and the steady rhythm of ordinary life. The so-called boring years matter because they are the soil from which dramatic change often grows. Just as the calm before a storm sets the stage for the storm itself, uneventful decades lay the groundwork for upheavals that follow. The 1820s may seem dull in the shadow of the Civil War, but they planted seeds of expansion, settlement, and debate that would eventually bloom into conflict. The 1950s, remembered for their calm suburban sameness, quietly set the stage for the cultural revolutions of the 1960s. And the 1990s, with their prosperity and calm, made the shock of the early 2000s feel even more jarring. These years are important too, because they remind us of the lived experience of ordinary people. Most human lives, after all, are not lived in moments of crisis. A farmer in the 1820s may have never fought in a war or seen the inside of a courtroom. A shopkeeper in the 1950s may have spent his entire life working, raising children, mowing lawns, and paying bills without ever making the front page. A teenager in the 1990s may have been more concerned with school dances, cassette tapes, and the early days of the internet than with politics or global events. Their lives may not feel dramatic in hindsight, but they were real, vivid, and meaningful. The boring stretches of history give us a fuller picture of humanity. They allow us to see not just the high peaks of great change, but the long valleys of quiet existence. They remind us that history is not just about presidents and wars, but also about families gathering for dinner, letters written by candlelight, children walking to school, and communities shaping themselves in small, unseen ways. It is also in these quiet years that culture often deepens. Music, art, and literature rarely spring from chaos alone. The still decades of the 1820s, for example, nurtured American writers and thinkers who would later shape the country's cultural identity. The suburban calm of the 1950s created the conditions for new art forms, new music, and new cultural expressions. Even the supposedly uneventful 1990s saw the birth of the digital revolution, a change whose consequences we are still living through today. The quiet years also help us understand the value of stability. For nations, stability is often invisible. Its importance is only felt when it is gone. A decade without war, without dramatic upheaval, may feel forgettable. But to the people living through it, it is often a blessing. In the quiet, people can plan, build, and dream. Stability gives them space to imagine futures for themselves and their children. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the boring years is that no year is ever truly boring. What feels dull in hindsight was once alive with detail, emotion, and texture. To live in the 1820s was to feel the promise of a new nation. To live in the 1950s was to feel the glow of prosperity and the hum of routine. To live in the 1990s was to feel the optimism of a new millennium on the horizon. The forgotten decades remind us that history is not just a collection of climaxes, but an ongoing story, with pauses, silences, and breaths between the louder moments. In the end, these quieter stretches of time matter not because of what they lacked, but because of what they quietly gave rise to: families built, ideas nurtured, technologies born, and the steady hum of everyday life that holds societies together. As we close this journey through America's boring years, let us not dismiss them as empty. Instead, let us see them as essential, as the hidden fabric of history that carries us from one chapter to the next. For just as in life, the quiet days are often the ones that give us strength, stability, and meaning, so too in history, the forgotten years matter more than they may at first appear. And so, perhaps the next time you hear a decade described as uneventful, as dull, as boring, you might think of it differently. You might imagine the families who lived through it, the quiet transformations that unfolded within it, and the ways in which it shaped the storms and triumphs yet to come. History is never truly boring. It only asks us to listen more closely, to the quiet spaces between the noise.